Good afternoon. Jimmy Scandirito, who is the defendant in this case, did not kill Skip Scandirito. And there is no evidence that supports that. This is an entirely circumstantial case. Jimmy and Skip actually enjoyed a very comfortable and a very loving relationship. Both father and son had gone to law school and graduated from law school. They shared many conversations about it. They shared common views about politics and loved to talk about that. Both men harbored a very deep appreciation for the game of golf. And they generally spent 2 or 3 days a week playing golf together for hours at a time. They enjoyed attending tournaments together and did so whenever the opportunity presented itself. They were both football fans. They both rooted for Michigan. Once a week, Skip Scandirito, Mr. Scandirito, the decedent in this case, would host what he called a survivor's party. And that's when he would invite people to come to the house and they would watch the show Survivor while they barbecued on the back pool patio. If the father and son were not in the same room together for any of these events, they would inevitably be communicating via text and chat rooms, often in group chats, sometimes just the two of them, exchanging commentary back and forth. In the last year before Skip Scandirito's death, the two, father and son, shared another event together, and it left them with a deep grief and a common understanding of each other. Terry Scandirito, which was Jimmy's father and Skip's wife of almost 50 years, passed away about a year before Skip Scandirito did. It left them both in grief, but for the elder Scandirito, who was approaching almost 75 years of age, it had a continued effect upon his health. Although they saw each other frequently, Mr. Scandirito and his son also shared a secret life, a life that some of their friends knew about and some of them didn't. When the state talks about the finances of Jimmy Scandirito, they do so only from the understanding of looking strictly at bank records. It had been a long time since Jimmy Scandirito relied on things like bank records and tax statements. Jimmy Scandirito and his father Skip were, as a general concept, engaged in the sale of drugs. And Jimmy had been doing that for a number of years. Most of his business was in cash. The elder Scandirito was aware of this and sometimes would actually make trips to states like Washington and Colorado to assist with acquiring supply. You will hear from many witnesses in this case that the relationship between Skip and between Jimmy was a different one than what you might generally expect of a father and a son. Jimmy called his father Skip, as did all of Skip's friends. Jimmy was an unplanned and unexpected child born at the end of the 60s. By all accounts, anyone who knew Terry and Skip Scandirito described them as individuals who were variously involved in politics and were big entertainers, from their home state in Michigan to when they came to Florida. Most of the neighbors who knew Skip and Terry Scandirito knew them because of the parties that they would throw at their house, where there was free-flowing alcohol, marijuana in various forms, and sometimes other drugs. And that was the environment that Jimmy grew up in the 70s. His first experimentations with marijuana, with alcohol, with cocaine, and with other drugs were in the presence of his father. That was the relationship that they had had throughout the years. There was no doubt, though, that there was no animosity between these two individuals. You will see that, in fact, from the text messages between them, from the description of friends and families. They spent a lot of time together, and they enjoyed each other's company, and they enjoyed doing things together. But in March of 2018, at the time that Skip Scandirito died, it was spring break. And it was spring break for Skip Scandirito and his friend Gary Goodwin, too. They had been friends for decades, since their teenage years. And Gary Goodwin regularly came to Florida at least once a year. And when he did, he would spend that time with Skip Scandirito and a few other friends. But he often lived or stayed with Skip Scandirito. March of 2018 was a particularly long visit. It was a long visit because Mr. Goodwin's wife had passed away approximately 5 years before. Skip's wife had died the year before. And for the first of the spring break visitations, both men were unmarried, unencumbered by significant others, unencumbered by young children or by grandchildren. They were simply two men who chose to spend the spring break much as they would have when they were in college and in graduate school. They drank. They used marijuana liberally. Skip sometimes mixed those substances with other narcotics. They went out. They drove to the Gulf Coast of Florida to visit others and to continue to golf and to drink and to party. They went to Miami late in the evening, listening to music and visiting restaurants. They ate expensive and fatty foods at their own home. They spent long nights up talking and partying with each other. And in fact, neighbors and others will say that by the end of this March, after Gary Goodwin had been there for several weeks, Skip was anxious for Gary to be gone. He was tired. He was 75 years old. He had spent 2 weeks partying with his friend. And Skip had serious heart issues. He had what the medical examiner will tell you was critical cardiac issues. He had had a heart attack. He had had open heart surgery. The primary way that they identified him in this case was by looking at x-rays of the previous heart surgeries. This medical examiner, Dr. Mote, will tell you in no uncertain terms that had Mr. Scandirito simply been found lying on the floor of his house, he would have concluded that it was simply a cardiac arrest. That's how severe his issues were. There is strong evidence that those issues had come to bother Skip very, very recently. In fact, Gary Goodwin, who had left for a couple of days to visit another friend on the Gulf Coast, the day before he left, 2 days before Skip's death, he describes a serious health concern that Skip had, where both of them thought he was having a stroke or a heart attack. They canceled their activities for that day. They stayed home. Skip did not go to a doctor. He did not get checked out by anybody. And he continued his spring break activities. On March the 28th of 2018, while Mr. Goodwin was away, Jimmy's father, Skip, had planned a day of golfing. They had actually planned a day involving 2 other individuals. It was going to be a foursome, but 2 of those individuals canceled unexpectedly, leaving Jimmy alone with his father to play golf. They played golf throughout the morning, coming home to the father's house at some time around lunchtime. It was a special day, really, for both of them. It was the eve of Terry's birthday. Her birthday was March 29th, but they were not going to enjoy any festivities on that day because it happened to coincide with the Miami tennis tournament that Skip had plans to attend. So they spent the 28th together partying. They were drinking. They were using marijuana in various forms. At the time of Mr. Scandirito's death, he had marijuana, alcohol, OxyContin, and hydrocodone in his system. It is likely what he had in his system when he spoke to Betty Butcher that night at 8:30 in the evening, where she clearly describes him as being quite intoxicated. But the other thing she describes is that she knows that Jimmy's there. And at 8:30 at night, they are laughing uproariously together at a film that they're watching. And they're drinking, and they're partying, and they're having a really good time. You're going to see in this case that in addition to that timeline of 8:30 p.m., there are additional timelines that play out in the course of an examination of Jimmy's phone. And what you're going to discover is that between 9:30 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., that Mr. Scandirito, the defendant, is texting. And he is consistently texting with a woman who is in Brazil. And they are exchanging text messages every minute or so for that couple of hours. Okay? And while they are texting, they are making reference to the Corinthians-Sao Paulo game, which is a soccer game, that they're both watching on different devices and talking about the scores and what's going on in the game and how to translate certain team names. You're going to see on the timeline for that phone that at the end of that period at about 11:30, there's an exchange of a funny video that's in Spanish. But it is consistent activity. Because during that time period, Jimmy Scandirito was outside of his home. He was on the back patio. He had left his father inside the house, and he had done so because after drinking extensively, he wanted to do something that his father absolutely did not approve of: smoke cigarettes. Didn't approve of that because Terry Scandirito, Jimmy's mother, and Skip Scandirito's mother had died of lung cancer. So it wasn't permitted in the house. And at the time that's the texting and the videos end on the phone at 11:30, Jimmy Scandirito comes back into the house. And when he does that, he finds that his father has not gone to bed, as he indicated he was going to do, because of his early morning commitments, but that Mr. Scandirito was lying in the living room area as if he had fallen face forward off of an automated lounging chair onto the ground. He felt slightly cooler to the touch than one would expect. It looked like he had vomited or frothed a little bit from the mouth. Mr. Scandirito's efforts to wake him and to revive him were unsuccessful. They had been partying all day, and there was a slew of legal and illegal drugs on a coffee table that was spilled over in the living room. Jimmy's first thought was that his father had used some of the cocaine that was there, and he panicked. His first thought was that he had to clean up the narcotics before he could call authorities, before he could call the police. Skip Scandirito, however, was a much larger man than Jimmy. He was a big guy, a big man. And Jimmy was unable to do more than simply roll him on his back. In a panic, he started thinking of, what can I do that will help this situation? How can I move my dad? How can I put him in a chair? How can I put him in the bed? How can I get him off the floor and clean up these materials? And indeed, you see his car leaving and returning to his father's house 5 times between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. He is Googling on his phone 24-hour Walmarts. He's clicking on Walmarts that are in Boynton Beach. He's looking for some way to be able to move his father, and he eventually finds that at 6 a.m. when he goes to Home Depot and he buys a cart to move him. He gets him off the floor, he cleans up the materials, cleans up the drugs, and he's been up all night. He's still intoxicated. He's not sure what to do. He doesn't want Betty Butcher coming to the house at this point, so he texts her to cancel the date. Then he leaves. He goes to his house. He goes to the Miami tennis tournament to sort of pretend that he's there. He comes back to his house. He sits around some more. He eventually returns to Boca Raton and the late afternoon of the 29th. Now, what's interesting about this story and what you should gather from it is that the timeline with Jimmy coming and going to his house, going to Miami, as will be deduced and testified to by the state's witnesses, takes him away from the house. He's not there. He is not at that house for any significant period of time after 12:30 a.m. until late in the afternoon. You know what happens at Skip Scandirito's house at 4:30 every afternoon? He has 3 cats, and he has a routine with the cats. And if he happens to not be home when it's time for the cats to come in and be fed, the next door neighbor, Ernie LeDuc, does it, as he did on this day when Jimmy was not there. He went into the house, he went into the kitchen area, he took care of the animals. There was not a thing out of place in the house. There were no broken dishes. There were no pillows tossed around. There was no furniture turned over. There was no blood. There was no broken glass. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Because there was no fight. There was no struggle. And Jimmy Scandirito did not kill his father. When Jimmy came back in the afternoon, however, he had decided that the best he could do would be to move his father's body, as he did, using the cart, to the garage, but that he would never be able to lift him into a bed, put him into a chair, lift him into a vehicle. He would never be able to do any of those things. It was not his plan to do something that is both horrifying and heartbreaking. But he was afraid. He knew all the neighbors knew he had been there the night before. He believed that his father had consumed cocaine while he was there. He knew that the neighbors would know that he had been there all night. He knew that there were surveillance cameras. and that if he told the police that his father had simply passed out on the floor, that something would likely be found out about it. And he panicked. Jimmy did something that he deeply regrets, and that is unfathomable to most individuals. However, the love that Skip Scandirito had for Jimmy and that Jimmy had for him was unconditional. All of the things that the state talks about in this case and has talked to you about here in this opening statement are things that happened after Skip Scandirito's death. After. They have no scientific evidence, no physical evidence, no direct evidence, no testimony from anyone that suggests that there was a bad relationship between Skip and Jimmy or that he killed his father. When the state talks about Mr. Scandirito, Jimmy's finances, they will produce for you a number of charts, as I've seen. They will produce for you many records from banks. They will talk about the low balance that is in Mr. Scandirito's bank accounts. What you're going to discover is that has been true for the last 3 years. You will also see a different pattern. You will see a pattern where there is consistently deposits of cash made to Jimmy's account that are used to pay pre-planned bills that are direct deductions from that account. You won't see the things that we all know we spend money on every single month using a debit card. Grocery stores, drug stores, gas stations. The everyday living expenses are not coming from there because he is living a life that is largely financed by cash. You will see that he is making deposits of as much as $2,800 a month cash to pay his rent directly into his landlord's account. You will see the records from the day that he played golf with his father, Skip Scandirito. You'll see he paid with a $100 bill, and there are no withdrawals from his bank account. When the state talks about Mr. Scandirito having money that Jimmy had, it's simply not true. Simply not. Mr. Scandirito also lived a pretty close to the vest life. And except for some trips that he took with his family, spent very little discretionary money. But Jimmy was giving him money on a regular basis every month to help him with his bills. That's borne out by the records as well. The only person that would have inherited any of the money from Mr. Scandirito was, in fact, Jimmy. That's true. Jimmy also had access to many of those accounts. He knew what the passwords were. He knew how they worked because his father had shared that with him. They were good friends. They were very good friends. If Jimmy had needed anything, Skip would have provided it to him. The only thing that the state presents in this case that would support an argument that Jimmy hurt his father is events that occurred after Skip Scandirito's death, not before, and this financial motive that they think they can prove. It's not enough. It's simply not enough. He did not kill his father. He made some terrible decisions, some criminal decisions in this case. But murder is not one of them. Thank you, Judge.